So Eric ran out to the car, screaming, I get the left side, I get the left side, I get the left side. Joseph said, no, you don't, I get the left side. No, you don't, I get the left side. No, you don't, I get the left side. So the father had a dilemma to settle. And so finally the father said, well, this time we're going to let Eric sit on the left side because he's the oldest. And Eric looked at his father, he smiled, and he said, thanks, Dad. Which side's the left side? James chapter 1, beginning in verse 1 is where we begin this evening. They're not getting any worse, you know. That's the main thing. That's the Reader's Digest ones, by the way. That was not... the Book of James. We've been asked to do the Book of James. Let me tell you kind of where I'm headed. And if you don't like that, please tell me. Please tell me, and we'll do something different. We are going to study the Book of James, but we'll do it a little differently. Tonight, what I hope to do is to introduce the book and to get through the first 11 to 12 verses of the first chapter. And what we're going to do, or what I plan on doing, is doing it by sections. That means, you know, that sometimes it may be a little bit preachy, but what I'm hoping is that you'll be able to read the sections with me, and you'll be able to really look at it maybe through the week and think about it and give some consideration to it, and you'll have some excellent thoughts, as I know you will. But if we do that, it'll take us 13 weeks to get through the Book of James. And so that will be the plan, to kind of get through in 13 lessons at least. It may be more than 13 weeks, depending on what all happens with regards to the calendar of church, but 13 lessons. And so, like I say, tell me if you like that idea. If you don't, just tell me that too, and we'll go from there and see what we can do. The Book of James is a great book. It begins by James, bondservant of Jesus Christ. Who is James? Well, Jesus' brother. Half-brother, actually, but brother. There are those that debate that is the James that it is, but he's the only one that it really fits, time-wise. The date of the book was probably somewhere around 46 AD in which it was written, so that makes it one of the first, if not the first book chronologically of the New Testament to be written. Depending exactly upon the date and depending upon the date of 1 Thessalonians, it's between those two, between 1 Thessalonians and James as far as chronologically, what time it was written, the first book of the New Testament. James, the half-brother of Jesus Christ, wrote a book that is very, very practical. It talks about things that are still going on today. We'll talk about prejudice when we get to James 2. We'll talk about what's going on in our world today. We'll talk about language, speech, James 3. We'll talk about death. We get on into James where he asks, what is your life? It is even as a vapor that appears for a short time and then vanishes away. We'll talk about everyday stuff, real stuff. It is, in many ways, it is probably the most contemporary book of the Bible. Now, that's not to say that the Bible is outdated. That's not to say that it doesn't fit us. But its subjects are so, like, almost out of the newspaper or off the internet, even today. And why we say that it's maybe the most contemporary is because there's not, and if you look at it, there's not a deep theological section in it. You take a look at Paul's writings. All of his books have a theological component to them. Usually it's about half the book. Say like, now it's not in the book of Romans. You spend the first 11 chapters of going through some deep thinking and deep thought, and you get to the 12th chapter and you finally say, now I can get something out of this book. You look at Ephesians, though, say, and you go through the first 3 chapters and you think, man, this is great stuff. It's stuff that we need, and it's stuff that I need, but it's heavy in theology. And then you get to the 4th chapter and you say, okay, it's more practical. Colossians is about the same way. It's divided up. The first chapter and a half, 2 chapters, theological, and the last is practical, and so forth and so on. James doesn't have that deep theological aspect or component to it. It's not condemning it. It's just that's the way the book is. It is a book, though, that is very diverse in its topics. Someone once said in a study of the book of James, it was not in a study that I had, but it was someone else, and they said, if I didn't know any better, I would think James had been reading my mail. It is that practical. It is just so down to earth. And yet, as we look at this book, we see a great many things with regards to who and what and things of that nature. The audience for the book is important. It is, I bring that up when I study a book because we need to understand who it was written to. One of the important aspects, as you know, but just to remind you, one of the important aspects in Bible study is to not only see and try to see ourselves in the text and what it means to me, but to see what it meant to the folks to whom it was written, and then see where I fit in and how it fits me. And so when we look at the book of James, we say, well, to whom was this book written? Well, it was written to Jewish Christians, and it was written to those that were, especially from Jerusalem, that were scattered abroad. Remember in Acts chapter 8 and in Acts chapter 12, you had what is called the diaspora, or the dispersion. The diaspora is the Greek word, but the dispersion, it was the dispersion of the Jews from Jerusalem, where they virtually just went everywhere because of persecution. And so James writes this book to Christians that were spread out. And they were spread out all over, and they were facing a lot of things. But one of the great things that they were facing was persecution. And so James writes to these folks, trying to help them through their persecution, trying to help them through their trials, trying to help them through their difficult times. It was a time of heavy persecution. Ananias was the high priest, and he ruled in such a way as to basically say, I'm the king, and if you don't like it, tough, and what I say goes, and if you don't like that, you'll be going. Felix was the emperor of the time. He also had a very heavy hand in ruling the people. And so it was a time that was difficult, but yet, if we gave it a theme, and if we tried to give it a theme, in as George was telling me today about a fellow in 10 words or less, the theme for the book of James is just daily Christian living. It's just that simple. We began, as we said in James 1, James kind of gives us a hint. He says that he's a bondservant of God, of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. You see, that gives us what we just talked about. Greetings, though. I had never really thought about it till today. I looked up the word greetings, and it was fascinating to me, because the word greetings here that James uses is the idea of rejoice. Be happy. And so he begins by telling them, rejoice, be happy. Literally, the word itself, if we were to look at the literal meaning of the word itself, it's to be conscious of God's grace. Now fit that idea within the rest of this book. That's powerful thinking, that he begins with that very idea. Be conscious of God's grace in all of life. Well, then he moves on. In verses 2 through 12, really, he talks about trouble. He talks about difficulties. And he talks about getting through trouble and profiting from trouble and trials. I don't know anybody that really likes trials. You know, our friend Jerry Barber says he likes criticism. I have proof to the fact that he doesn't. I really do. I really do have proof. Most of us don't like criticism. Most of us don't like trials either. We don't like problems. I mean, you know, if I were to ask you who likes problems, nobody would raise their hand. Why? Because we don't like it. What do we like? Smooth, calm, peaceful, right? When do you go fishing? When the wind's up and the lake is rough, or when it's smooth, or not really not smooth, but when it's at least calm, right? When do you like to go outside? When tornadoes coming through? Well, some people do. I was accused once of that. But I was with the sheriff of the county. We were on the front porch of the church building, and the other preacher that was down in the basement cowering really got on to me the next day. You should have been down there with me. I said, I was up with the sheriff, and we knew exactly where it was going. All we had to do was listen to the radio. And so I said, we weren't even close. And I said, I was having a good time. And I will say this today, that day, that sheriff was not a Christian, but today that sheriff is a Christian. So I don't know that I helped, but maybe I did. Who knows? But anyway, the point is, we just don't like trials. We don't like them. James does not say that we're not going to have trials. The Bible doesn't say we're not going to have trials. But James basically says, let's look at them. Let's profit from them. He begins in verse 2. Trouble's a reality. Notice what he says. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Don't you just stop right there? I know verse 3 goes with it. Don't get me wrong. Because there's not a period there. There's a comma there at the end of verse 2. But when you just read that statement, that phrase, you just, it's hard to believe. Count it all joy. You know, that was like, in essence, and I got spanked. When I grew up, you know, they would spank you still. And my parents believed in spanking. And I never enjoyed a spanking. My dad, one of the stories that he often told on me was the time, and Dad didn't spank me a lot because Dad believed that, like, if Mom was there, and Mom would seem like she was always there, if I did it and made Mom upset, Mom ought to spank me. And then if Dad was there and I upset him, he ought to spank me. And so Dad didn't spank me a lot. There was a reason for that. I could push my mom to the very edge and usually pushed her over, and then she spanked me. Dad, I knew when Dad, okay, I back off. But Dad said that he spanked me one time, and he said, he turned me around after it was over with, and he said, son, I love you. And he said, your lip just quivered, and you said, I love you. I don't think I loved that spanking, though. James says, count it all joy. The word joy, as you might guess, means joy. Happy. Count it happy. Notice what he says, though. When you fall, the word fall there is another interesting word. It's the idea of falling around. It can also mean surrounded by various trials. The word various is interesting. It's actually the idea of many colors. Various trials. Many colored trials. Now, when we think of trials, what do we think of? Don't everybody answer at once. We think of difficulties, right? Hard times. Sometimes it can be inward trials. And the word itself, the Greek word itself here, does not help us to differentiate whether it's inward trials or outward trials. Now, it could be outward trials because we said, look at what we said. This was to Jews that were Jewish Christians that were spread everywhere, suffering persecution. But it seems it has the feel, doesn't it, of being inward trials. My own personal problems, my own personal trials, my own personal difficulties, my own personal temptations. Whether it's fears or discouragement or headaches or heartaches, hurts or disappointments. We really don't know, but we could, in many ways, classify all of them, right? And then he says, verse 3, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. Knowing. Now, put the idea of knowing with the idea of many trials. In the midst of a trial, in the midst of a difficulty, what's usually a common reaction among people? To question God, right? Why me? Why is this happening to me? Why am I going through this? I don't understand. That's common. And in many ways, it's all right. Go to the book of Psalms if you don't think it is and see how many times the psalmist in many ways says, why me? Or why is this happening to me? Or help me to understand, or give me some insight, or I don't understand. Well, James says, knowing that the testing, well, we understand the idea of testing, being put to the test. The testing of your faith produces or results in patience. Now, patience, we think of patience as a person that is just able to sit calmly in the midst of chaos and is able to endure it without too many questions, comments, or problems. And that's a good way of looking at it. But the word here has the idea of endurance. In many ways, though, if you think about it, here's what James is saying. The same thing that when we read Hebrews chapter 12, we found out. The trying of your faith produces character. Build your character. Doctors tell us, if you want to build muscle, exercise. If you want to build your heart muscle, exercise it by exercising. Well, if you want to build the character that God wants you to have, you got to go through some of these heartaches and hurts. Now, here's the problem I struggle with. Not that I have problems or don't have problems. I struggle with the fact that some of my friends have more problems than others of my friends have. Right? You got some friends that just, it seems like they go from one storm to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And there are some folks that just, they have a storm and it may be several months before they have another storm, or maybe even a year or two. And some, it may be more often or less often. And it's hard to, why do they have more and they have less and they just seemingly don't have any? Why is that? And I can't answer that. I don't have a biblical answer for it other than to say we all have storms. And sometimes those storms are unknown, but we have storms. James says it's all right. He says you just need to know that it produces endurance. It produces patience. And he says, verse 4, patience have its perfect or complete work, that you may be perfect or mature is another way of looking at the word, and complete, lacking nothing. So in other words, it builds character. Makes you better. It's that exercising of your faith. Well, in the exercising of your faith and the validation of your faith, we've got to have some help. How are we going to get through this? In verse 5, James answers that. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. Now I want you to see verse 5 and the beginning of verse 6. I want you to look at it with a little different perspective. I want you to look at it from the standpoint of, let's learn a little bit about God. In the midst of our trials, all of a sudden we can learn a little bit about God. Well, what can we learn about God? First of all, notice that he says, ask. God's approachable. And then he says, with regards, he gives. So we ask, he gives. And how does he give? Well, he gives to all. He's not partial, he's impartial. So we have a God that's approachable, a God that gives, a God that's impartial and generous, because he gives liberally. Not stingily, not half-heartedly. He gives liberally. And notice that it says that he gives without reproach, reprimand. In other words, he doesn't look down on some because of the position that they're in. We're guilty of that, right? Do you drive down the streets of Nashville and see somebody on the side of the road, and what do? The first thing you say, oop, they look down and out. Second thing you do is what? Check, make sure your door's locked if you're going to stop right where they are, right? I understand that. I understand. We all do it. God doesn't look down upon us because of the position that we're in. And notice that he says, and it will be given to him. God's responsive. God responds. My wife asked me a question the other day, and I didn't have a good answer for it, so I didn't respond. That was not a good idea either. But nevertheless, God's not that way. God responds. And then the first part of verse 6 says, but let him ask in faith, with no doubting. God is a God that gives us the assurances so that we won't doubt. But we have to understand we have to ask. And so God demands that we ask him. Let's back up now and let's combine verses 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 with the thought. Okay, we got trials. How are we going to get through them? Verse 5, let him ask in faith. Let him ask what? Let him ask wisdom. If any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. What's wisdom? Wisdom is the ability to put into action what you know. That's wisdom, really. Now, James is going to talk a little bit more about wisdom that is from above, is pure and peaceful and gentle. The wisdom here is wisdom that puts to action what has been told. I want you to think about something. James, in this paragraph, is talking about trials, difficulties, problems, heartaches, hurts, disappointments. And as he's talking about all this, James says, okay, we've got them, 2 and 3, verses 2 and 3. Now he says, ask God for wisdom. Not knowledge. Isn't it interesting? The Bible never instructs us to ask for knowledge. Why is that? You gain that yourself. You got it, and you've got to get it yourself. But he says, pray for wisdom so that you can apply what you know. That is when you think about the providence of God, that's a fascinating thing. There's a whole lot more about the providence of God that I don't understand than what I do understand. Okay? There really is. Yes, I preach on it. I believe it because I've seen it in my life. I understand it. But I don't understand it. And so, really, to me, at this point in my life, I understand that while I can believe it, I've seen it, I think I've experienced it, I still have to say I walk by faith. Because God didn't give me all the answers that I want with regards to providence. James says, if you're going to walk in the midst of those storms, you ask for wisdom. God will give you what you need in order to get through it. Because he says, God gives, and God gives how? Liberally. But he does tell us, verse 6, to do what? Ask. And so as we ask, notice that we're to ask in faith. Someone, I was reading today, someone wrote with regards to asking in faith, they said, ask in power and desire of God. I believe it's David Roper in his book. And that's a great thought. Ask within power and desire of God. But he goes on to say, don't doubt. Now, what part of that might we doubt? Well, we might doubt that God is going to get us through it, right? We might doubt that God is going to answer us, right? Because, why? Because time elapses in the midst of trials. God's time is different than our time. You ever notice that? And the way things work out sometimes are really strange. But that's God's way of getting everybody and everything prepared. And so, James reminds us, don't doubt. Because the doubting man, he's like a wave in the sea driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man. In other words, he's a man that has faith, but he doubts. Well, God, would you take it? I don't know if he will or not. God, would you send this? Well, I don't know that he can. God, would you do this? He hasn't done it to others. Why would he do it to me? James says, that's the double-minded man. He's unstable. The word unstable I found interesting as I was looking at it today. It's the idea of staggering about as if you were inebriated. And so he says here, he says, the double-minded man is like a man staggering around that is drunk. He's trying to keep feet on ground, but the wind is tossing the boat back to and fro. And so James reminds us to be careful. And then in verses 9, 10, and 11, he sneaks something in on us. He changes in many ways, because I think verse 12 could really, if you will, could almost come up and follow verse 8. But I want you to look at and gain a perspective here of what James does. James says, let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation. The lowly brother. The lowly brother is the brother of little means. He's the poor man. He's the man that doesn't have the big job. He doesn't have the big house. He doesn't have the big car. He doesn't have the big bank account. He doesn't have the big trust fund. He doesn't have investments. He doesn't have anything much. He does, he ekes out an existence in life. And he's thankful for it, but that's all he gets. And so he really, though, when he's like that, what do you hear most often from folks that are in that condition? Griping, right? Complaining. Well, I'm not like him. I don't have the big job or the big car or the big boat or the big whatever. And James says, look, let that lowly brother, let him glory in his exaltation. Well, we've got to read further to understand that. But just hold that thought. He says, but the rich in his humiliation, but the rich is brought down. Okay, the lowly brother is going to be exalted by the love, the care, the power, the providence of God in the midst of his trials. You see, I still understand, or I think I understand now why verses 9, 10, and 11 are seemingly in the midst of a discussion and breaks up. And verse 12 follows. Because he says, okay, here's the lowly brother in the midst of his problems. You're going to be exalted. But the rich man in his humiliation, the rich man in his problems, the rich man in his difficulties, because as a flower of the field, he will pass away. You see, he can't buy his way out of death. He can't buy his way out of trials either. He'll pass away, though. He'll die. For no sooner has the sun risen with a burning heat than it withers the grass, its flower falls, its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits. To me, here's what 9, 10, and 11 says. Doesn't matter who you are. You're going to have trials. And it doesn't matter who you are. You're going to die. You're going to die. That's what Solomon said. Do you remember in your studies of the Book of Ecclesiastes? Isn't that the same thing Solomon went through? So that's a great book to study. Sometime, Lord willing, we'll study the Book of Ecclesiastes. It's a great book to study because Solomon, he's searching for happiness. And by the 3rd chapter, he's worn everything out. He's worn out wine, women, health, wealth, that health and wealth God of today. He's tried everything. He's tried riches. He's tried pleasures. He's tried power. He's tried everything. And he realizes all of it's vanity. And then you get to about the 10th chapter, especially the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th chapters of the Book of Ecclesiastes. And Solomon basically says this: we're all going to die. He doesn't mean it in a bad way, though. He takes it very well. Well, that's what James is saying. We got problems, but that's all right. When you are the low man, the poor man, and you go through, hey, you're being exalted. Why? Because God's testing your character, seeing how good you are, seeing if your faith is really what it needs to be. Just know that the great man, the man, as he calls him, the rich man, just know that he will die as well in his humiliation. And so you have the elevation of the poor and the humbling of the rich. Boy, I never thought about it. That's good. Yeah. And could have been. Could have been. I hadn't even thought about that. That's a good analogy, yeah. That's good. Anything else? That's terrible, isn't it? That'll make you sick, won't it? Ugh. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's awful. Awful feeling. You can't get off. You ain't got nowhere to go, and yeah, that's true. That has to be a miserable feeling. Sure does. Well, it toughened you, that's for sure. Had to, though, didn't it? Wow. Verse 12. A lot of folks divide it out. Verse 12, though, in many ways goes with it. We'll come back to verse 12 again next week. But blessed is the man who endures temptation, who endures his trials. For when he has been approved, in other words, he's been put to the test, and he's passed the test, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. The crown of life. John MacArthur, who is an evangelical, wrote a commentary on the book of James, and I'll refer to him some through this study. MacArthur talks about there are 4 crowns, that it's a possibility, and says that it could be any of these, but it's probably the eternal crown of God. So blessed is the man who goes through the trials, but when he's tested and he's found proved, he'll receive the crown of life, which the Lord's promised to him. What a great thought that is. What a great blessing that is to end on. To understand that even though we have trials, there's rejoicing and reward in the end. And if you're on a boat for 3 hours, throwing up your guts, it's the fact that you do get off of it. And we're glad you did. We're very glad you did, and appreciate what you did for us. Anything else? Well, verse 12, I think, concludes that thought, but it'll also go with our next thought. And we'll basically only be looking at verses 12 through 18 next week. So kind of short there. And we may include 19 and 20. I tell you what, read 12 through 20, and you'll be ready for our discussion next week. Anything else? Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we are so thankful for this day. We're thankful that you love us and watch over us, and we're thankful for that you care for us. We're thankful for your word and for the fact that it really does help us through life. For tonight we see that we all have trials, and that we can come to you and you'll help us go through those trials. And while we wish no trials upon anyone, we ask that you help us as we go through the trials of our own particular life, that we will always stick with you, and that we'll always have the strength and the comfort that we need. We ask that you watch over us, that you bless us and keep us. Forgive us of our sins, for this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week. Thank y'all.